Well, we're a minute out, so why don't we go ahead and kick it off? This is the second edition of the Noon Peanut Report. And I hope it just continues to grow, even though our attendance live isn't what we want it to be by any means. I hope that people are picking up their recordings and listening to it later while they're on the tractor or whatever at a time that's more convenient to them. So we're going to keep doing this. Each month we'll change it up a little bit. We're already excited about the May report because we'll be using some county agents from around the state. Terry Milliken from Gaines County, Brianna Gonzalez from Frio County, Leonard up in Clarendon, whatever county that is.
That's
And
Donley. Yeah, Donley.
thank you, Donley County, and then Mike Berry from Comanche. So I think we'll have a good group next month, kind of give us a little update on how things are looking in their area. But this month we've got Dr. John Cason with Dr. Todd Baughman as the host, and we're so glad everyone is here with us today. So Todd, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Shelley. And again, I would like to throw a thank you out to you and the Texas Peanut Producers Board for your longtime support of our research and extension programs with AgriLife. That's definitely well used, well received. And so we appreciate that and appreciate this opportunity to use this outlet to highlight some of our research and extension programs. So with that, Johnny Cason, our peanut breeder located at Stephenville. Johnny, why don't you tell people a little bit about your background, kind of where you grew up and how you got to where you're at today?
Okay. Well, I don't know that it's a super interesting story, but I grew up in Abilene, Texas, which is just about 110 miles west of where I'm at now. My dad was a Baptist minister. He grew up on a farm, surrendered to the ministry, and we ended up in Abilene. So I was born and raised in Abilene, Texas, but I'm the only person there probably that can say that has a pretty thick East Texas accent. It's a weird combination, but that's the way it is. So I graduated from high school there and actually started college at Hardin-Simmons University. Did a little bit of time at ACU as well because they had an intercollegiate ag program. Just because of my dad's background and my family still has a farm there in East Texas, I grew up around it. And so it was something that I felt like I wanted to go into, decided to major in agriculture. Hardin-Simmons actually had an ag program as well as ACU. It was kind of intercollegiate. And that was actually where I first had my first experience with peanuts. I don't know if most people probably know Dr. Foy Mills. At that time, he taught at ACU. He was my agronomy professor. And he had a lab back then where they were doing quality analysis for peanuts. And, he would talk about it in class. And it was kind of my first introduction into the peanut world. I didn't have any idea I would ever come in contact with it again. I was kind of looking at animal agriculture. Somewhere along the way, cost became an issue at a private university. And then I was doing some math and it just wasn't going to work out. So I transferred to Tarleton here in Stephenville, majoring in animal science. And that's kind of the direction I thought I would end up going into. I wanted to be in cattle breeding. Somewhere along the way, I got a job here at the experiment station. And actually, my first job in Stephenville was at the dairy sale, Erath County Dairy Sale. And the first person I met had his nose bitten off in a bar fight. And it was a pretty rough crowd that I was working with. And I thought, man, I have to find another job. Asked somebody from Abilene if they knew anybody here, and ended up they had a high school friend that worked here at the experiment station. So as a 20-year-old college student, I started working here at the Stephenville Research and Extension Center. So I've been here for the better part of my life. I've actually lived in Stephenville, worked here at the station longer than I lived with my parents. So, as far as being around the Texas A&M system, I've been with it for a very long time. So I started as a college student, graduated. I went home for a little bit, found a wife, brought her back with me, convinced her. At that time, Stephenville was a really little town, and I convinced her to move to what she thought was the end of the earth. She was raised in a big city, but I started full time as a technician here in 1996. So my journey to peanuts started, I mean, as a college student at the bottom level, doing the grunt work, and then I moved into a technician, research technician, field technician, eventually a research associate. And I always like to tell people that back then I got to learn how to grow peanuts the right way. Dr. Simpson, who was my boss, he stressed to me, don't spare any expense when you're growing these plots. I want you to do everything that's recommended. So I learned from the ground up herbicides. I learned fungicides. We did a full, Southeast fungicide spray at that time. And so I always felt kind of blessed because I didn't have to worry about cost, and I got to grow peanuts, the way it was recommended. I did that for about 25 years. During that time, worked on my master's, got a master's in nematode resistance is where I did my thesis work in Comanche County. And then as Dr. Simpson got older, they started a PhD program at Texas A&M that was a distance breeding program, and he was able to be my chairman. And so I started on a PhD in 2013, finished in 2018, and then started in my current position in 2019. So I've been with the system almost 30 years, I guess 31 years now, if you count my student labor, but have been around peanuts that whole time. And when I started at the research center, I did not know anything about peanuts. I mean, I knew they grew underground because, you learn that in agronomy, but that was about the extent of my experience with peanuts. And it's been a exciting and a great career. I love every second of it. I mean, I never have a problem getting out of bed or sending emails in the middle of the night or whatever I need to do, because there's always something to do, and I enjoy all of it.
Well, Johnny, I'd say that's a lot more exciting story than you started us out thinking about. So with that, maybe give a little bit of history on the peanut breeding program, where it developed and where we're at today.
Okay. Well, being here at Stephenville, I've been around it for a long time. So if you go back to, this center was formed in 1939, and it was created to do sandyland peanut research in Central Texas area. And at that point, that was one of the major areas of production. Peanuts back then, I think, were spread out all over Texas. There were pockets up at the Red River. There were some over towards Texarkana, down Houston, north and east of Houston, South Texas, and then Central Texas was the big area. That research center started in 1939. The first director of the center became the lead peanut breeder. And if you go back to that time frame, it was probably Spantex was the most commonly grown. Spanish peanuts were grown in Texas as the main crop. He created the first structured crossing program, and from that, the variety Star was released, I believe, around 1960s. As you move forward through the time frame, at that point in the breeding of peanuts, it was, if you got a variety out every 10 years or later it became every 2 to 3 years, you were doing really good. And so even up through the 60s, there weren't that many varieties available. Dr. Simpson started here in 1967, and kind of a interesting story. If you go back to when the station was started, he said there was, even back then, there was a lot of political things going on, and there was a kind of a underhanded deals that the research center was supposed to be in Comanche County. There were some political deals made, and it was moved to Erath County, and there were some people that were mad about that for a long time. He said in 1967, when he started, they went to a farmer's house in Comanche County and got ran off with a shotgun because that experiment station was supposed to be in Comanche County, and he was still mad about it. So some people hold grudges a long time, but anyway, we're in Erath County, which historically was kind of the edge of the peanut production area. when it was in Central Texas. Comanche County was kind of the epicenter of all that. And then, so Dr. Simpson started in the 70s, 67, and then started really hitting his stride in the 70s. And as that happened, peanut breeding variety development kind of picked up. There were more varieties, probably 2 or 3 in the 70s, 2 or 3 in the 80s. And then that's accelerated more the later we've gone into the last 10 or 15 years. And so peanuts have always been here at the Stephenville Center. Over that time period, I think the Yoakum Center was another one that came in along. I don't know when it started, but it's been over 50 years. It's had peanuts. The Vernon Center was another area. And then the last area to kind of move into peanuts was when they moved out to Lubbock, and now we have a peanut breeder there in Lubbock. And so the peanut program as a whole, for a long time was centered out of Stephenville. I think now you would say it's probably centered out of Lubbock, with Vernon and Stephenville kind of also having peanut faculty there on staff.
So I would say, just because not only, of course, was Dr. Simpson a great peanut breeder, he's even a more amazing gentleman even today. So what's Dr. Simpson up to?
I think today he is plumbing, is what he told me he was going to do. He had a leak somewhere he had to fix. And I think his daughter and granddaughter were coming into town. But Dr. Simpson, like I said, he started in 1967. And I was telling somebody the other day, when I started working with him, he would work 7 days a week. He took Saturday afternoons off to go eat dinner with his wife, and he took Sunday mornings off to go to church. Other than that, he was out here at the greenhouse. And if you know anything about him, I mean, wild species are his passion. He started collecting wild species in 1979, going trips to South America, collecting wild species peanuts, bringing them back. He did that up until, the political climate change where he couldn't bring them back, and he even continued going up through 2014. That was the last time he was able to get any materials out of South America to the U.S. But he continued going up until his health just what he said. He told me he was afraid he was going to fall and break a hip or something. So he just didn't feel like he could go out in the jungle and collect anymore. But he's still very involved in wild species. Is basically what he focuses on now. He still has collaborators in South America. He's not out here 7 days a week. Well, he's out here 7 days a week. He's just not out here as many hours a day. But pretty much every day he's here at some point.
So I guess we can say he set an excellent example for you then on work ethic for sure. So
he definitely did. Yes. I had 2 pretty good examples in my life, my father and Dr. Simpson, and they both pretty similar work ethic.
Yeah. So just kind of describe to everyone what goes into a breeding program, kind of the steps from across to a release variety.
Yeah, so you kind of gave me a few heads up on some of these questions, and I was like, man, that's a big question right there. We could cover that one, and maybe we could solve world peace. I don't know, but just how long we want to talk about it. So as I thought about that, I think if I was going to talk about breeding in general, and keeping in mind, corn probably, they have unlimited funding. Cotton is a big crop. Wheat is a big crop. They have a lot more funding available. And so when you get into corn breeders, you may have a breeder that just focuses on one county in Iowa. That's his whole county. That's his whole breeding program. Here in Texas, we have 2 breeding programs within Texas A&M. We have 2 private companies that operate here. We have a breeding program in Oklahoma, New Mexico. And so all in all, we have probably 5 or 6 breeding programs going on, individual breeders that have their own program. And then within that, you have specialties that, as my interests lie different than Naveen's or Mark's, I conduct my breeding program a little differently. But if you were going to divide up the process of breeding, I think you could say there's pre-breeding, breeding, and then seed commercialization and development. And it takes all of those to get a variety to market. The pre-breeding one, typically, that's going to be somebody like Dr. Simpson, who has a passion for wild species. Trait enhancement is what he calls it, trait integration. He finds a trait like nematode resistance, and he brings that in from wild species peanut. That's a long-term project that you're going to be working on. I always tell everybody, if you're talking about a regular variety taking 8 years to develop, if you're going to bring in something from wild species, you're talking 20 years to get that done. I mean, so over a lifetime, you're going to do that 2 or 3 times, and you're going to spend your whole career doing that. As things have progressed, there's more pre-breeding that has gone on. You've had marker-assisted selection that's been introduced, and as part of that, you have to identify the markers that you're going to use, and so that can be considered pre-breeding. You have to find a trait, you have to develop a marker for it before you can use it in a marker-assisted selection program. That all takes time, but once you have that, then you can move it into the traditional conventional breeding program. The key to any breeding program is variation. You want to have differences among plants that you can exploit for whatever trait that you're trying to create. So if I have a nematode resistant plant, I want to find, or if I have a susceptible plant, I want to find a resistant plant. And then you have to move that resistance into something that is commercially viable for a farmer to grow. And variation is the key to any breeding program. When you get into traits like yield, drought resistance, some of those top traits, they are many genes involved. And so you can't just, it's not a straightforward breeding like it's either resistant or it's not. You have to kind of gather up as many genes as you can in any one cross and move that forward. Before I leave the pre-breeding, there is newer things that have come along like genomics, where we've sequenced the peanut genome, which has greatly sped up the development of markers because now we know where everything's at. And then most recently you have gene editing that's coming along. And gene editing is probably going to be something that really drives things in the future. Within the peanut industry, I think we're probably a little bit behind other crops just because peanuts are, directly used in foods, and peanut as the industry decided they really wanted to back off from gene editing when we, over probably 10 years ago. That seems to be changing a little bit. And I think it's going to be a pretty major tool in the future as we move forward, just not right now. But gene editing, marker-assisted selection, marker development, all that kind of straddles the fence between pre-breeding and breeding. And then once you move into a conventional breeding program, you kind of have elite material. You've kind of collected some traits that you want to move forward in your breeding program. Hopefully it's a good yielder. Hopefully it's a good grader. And then what value-added traits do you want to put onto that? High oleic, nematode resistant, drought tolerance. You can add all these things, and they all take time to add. And so in our program, in my program right now, we're basically a conventional program where I make crosses every year. I develop populations. I screen those in the field for agronomic traits. I also have a list of markers that I'm now using. So we have markers for leaf spot, nematode resistance, and oleic are the ones that we're currently selected for. So I can make a cross, send those off to be tested, get them back, and only plant the ones that are resistant. And I don't know how much you want to get into the logistics of that, but the more traits you add, the bigger your population has to be. And so the more work it is, both up front to get it to send off to be tested, and then to get the numbers that you need to fill up your field plots. And the field plots to me are the backbone of any breeding program. Once you make those crosses, make those initial selections for pod type, plant type, those type traits that are highly heritable, then you move into what we call replicated yield trial testing. And that's usually done at multi-locations over multi-years. Typically 3 to 4 years is a minimum that you want to test something before you're going to release it. So that and you want to test it in lots of different environments, lots of different management scenarios, so that you have a really good idea of how that's going to perform in a lot of different areas. And within Texas, it's really, we have 2 distinct growing regions. You know, South Texas, their growing environment is very similar to the Southeast. It's an arid area, but they're closer to the coast. They have higher humidity, a lot more fungicide problems, or fungus problems, a lot more just disease problems in general. They typically follow that Southeast spray schedule. That's, you know, high fungicide applications. West Texas, it's you know, much more arid. Irrigation has historically been good. Now it's starting to decline, and capacity is starting to be an issue. But generally, a line that I develop in West Texas, I have lines that will do better in West Texas than they do in South Texas, and vice versa. That becomes an issue within the Texas industry because there can only be so many varieties that seed companies can handle logistically, and so you have to kind of you know, compromise in some areas. You may not take the best thing in one area, but it does, you know, fairly well in both areas, and so you have to kind of decide which ones you're going to move forward with and make some decisions from a breeding perspective on that. Once you have something though, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Johnny.
Well, I was just going to say, so I can give you an example here recently. So, you know, I started in 2019. We actually started making crosses. I was making the decisions on the crosses a year or 2 before that. As Michael Baring kind of approached retirement, he started trying to let me do some of the decisions. And we had a line that went into the field in 2020. So the cross was made about 2 years before that, 2018. And it's done very well. So we released it this year, and then we did a subsequent one in 2021. I consider that pretty aggressive. I mean, like, we identified the 2021 line after 1 year of testing. It did really good, and we were like, I think this might be one that we want to release, even though we'd only tested it for 1 year. So we kind of accelerated the testing, moved it into, once we had enough seed, moved it into a lot of locations and really pushed it, and it did well the second and the third year. So about that third year, we started doing a seed increase on that. And so here 2018, the cross was made. 2021, it went into first year of yield testing, and we released it this year in 2025. That's a pretty short turnaround. I mean, that's about everything going perfect. Now, that being said, that variety is still not going to be in the hands of farmers for about probably this year. It will be in seed increase. Next year it will be in seed increase. And then the following year, there'll be as much seed available as they need. So even in the most aggressive format, you still are 8 years to get it to market. And that's just the way it is. It's not going to change if you do gene editing. It's not going to change with marker assisted selection. That's just logistically what it takes to test it and increase the seed for release.
So I think go ahead, Shelley.
Hey, can I ask a question real quick? Johnny, what's the difference in gene editing and non-transgenic breeding and GMO?
So GMO is the old historic way when you talk about Roundup Ready, that and Mark, I saw his name pop up a minute ago. He might be able to answer some of these questions better than me, but so GMO, that's the older technique where they take something from another plant, a totally different plant, they insert it using something called a gene gun, and it's kind of like a bringing a hammer to whatever you're doing, because they just shoot it into the DNA they embed that gene onto like little particles and shoot it in there with a gene gun. And so you don't really know exactly what you're getting, but then you screen it and, we got Roundup resistance out of that.
Okay.
So there's a lot of kickback on GMOs. Europe doesn't want them. A lot of countries don't want them. Gene editing is a little more, there's a little more finesse to that. They found some enzymes that will actually snip DNA, and the first things that were developed from gene editing, it can snip it and then it can put it back together. So you can, the earliest Cas CRISPR-9 is what it's called. The earliest ones, it would snip the DNA, it would join it back together. So it was called a gene knockout. And so you find a gene that maybe has some trait that is negative and you snip it out. And those have been around the longest. I was looking this morning because I kind of thought there might be some questions on gene editing. So you have knock-in genes that are becoming more common. It said there were some things on the market, but I couldn't find anything that was. But on a knock-in, you would snip it, and then you would take something from a related plant. So maybe like I had a nematode-resistant line over here, and I had a really good yielder in another line, and I wanted to insert nematode resistance into that. You could knock that in. And so that would be, I think that's kind of still not very common. And I know it's not common in peanuts, but I don't think it's very common in any crop. When you get into some of the bigger crops like corn, where they have more money, it could be something that's more common. But I think that's just now kind of coming to the forefront. The thing that with gene editing, with GMOs, that I think I would be, just want to mention is that even in both of those cases, you create this variation that wasn't there, which like I said, that's the key to any breeding program. It still has to be tested in the field. You don't know what that, especially when you're doing a GMO, when you're shooting it into the DNA, what that's going to do to the rest of the plant, because you don't even know where it ends up. With gene editing, it's a little more specific. You know kind of where it's at. You know exactly what you did, but you still don't exactly know everything that happens in that plant. So testing becomes essential.
One of the big differences of gene editing is that with GMO, you're taking a gene from one species and putting it in another, and that's where some people are concerned that maybe it'll do something that's not expected. With gene editing, the idea is the gene is already there, but it's a different allele. The sequence is a little different. And so if you could just change the sequence of what's already in peanut, and that can be done by gene editing. And that way it's not considered taking a gene from one species to another. You're just kind of making a mutation in that gene. Well, mutation breeding's been around for a long time. You could put seeds in a nuclear reactor or use ethane methyl sulfate, sulfonate to make mutations. And so at least the USDA doesn't consider gene editing to be a GMO, but AgriLife, Texas A&M Biosafety Office does, so to get permission to do it. And apparently the Europeans still consider it to be a GMO. So, but the idea is that, as Johnny said, it's a lot more precise because you can make very specific changes in a gene. And ideally it wouldn't be considered a GMO, so it'd be a lot easier to release it without what, people tell me, people in the industry, it costs like $10 to $120 million to prove that your new variety is safe if it's a GMO. And who's got that sort of money unless you're a really, really big company?
So a couple things, and Mark, that number's way low on what it costs to get a GMO out there. One of the things Johnny brought up about the GMOs being somewhat haphazard in that insertion, I think that's why we've seen most of those related to either, say, a herbicide resistant trait or an insect resistant trait, because that's an easy way to screen those plants. You basically do the insertion, you apply the herbicide that you're looking for, or you apply the insect that would potentially feed on that plant. Obviously, any of those that live through those types of tests, you know that you got the gene inserted in the right place. So that's why I think it's led more to those types of traits rather than some of, drought tolerance, nitrogen use efficiency. Those are a lot harder to screen for when you're not sure where it's going. Gene editing potentially could help with some of that, where it is a little more precise where that gene is actually being deleted or inserted. I think from the European standpoint, that still inserting DNA is where the CRISPR technology is being questioned versus the knockout, and I think that's where some of that discussion and argument with some of these other countries are going. So, and where we'll end up on that, who knows? Some of those are just trade barriers and not necessarily based specifically on the science.
Yeah. And I know years ago, when I was in school, they said you can't even detect a gene edit a generation out. So how do you know that if I say I did that traditionally, who's to say? Now I have heard some rumors that now they may have a way to tell that, but I don't know. But those are the top questions that are being answered right now in the gene editing world. And I think, one thing that we can use it for now is definitely to, knock out a gene and see what the purpose of that gene is, how it affects the plant, and use it as a tool to either develop markers or just to move forward science in general. And then we kind of work out the specifics of that. And then when the industry's ready to move forward with it, we're ready to go.
So Johnny, kind of based on our discussion, you mentioned about making a cross. How do you determine how to make a cross? What goes into that cross? What affects that decision?
I mean, so I came from an animal background, so I kind of go back to that. You look at when you're making, you want to make a cow and a bull, you see some traits that you like in both and you want to combine them. It's the same thing in peanuts, in any plant. I generally will make a list with our greenhouse manager and I'll tell her, look, this one has leaf spot resistance. This one is good yield. I need to combine those two. When I do, I typically get something in the middle that then I have to, and usually I get a spread of things in the middle. So I have to kind of find the one that has the traits that I want. But it's just, it's that simple. I'm just taking a trait of something in one plant that I like and crossing it in a plant with another. Generally, when I do those crosses, usually the mother, what's the female of the cross, typically carries a few more of the traits in the next generation. And so I typically will, try to make maybe the good yielder the female of the cross and then have the trait that I'm trying to put onto that, the male. So that's kind of my thought process on it.
Well, and I think you brought up a good point that you might expound on a little bit, because I think sometimes we think, okay, so you've got a good yielding variety and you've got a leaf rust resistance or leaf spot or, whatever trait that is. Why can't we just make those crosses and then release that variety? I think maybe expound a little bit on how that doesn't necessarily work.
Yeah, so nematode resistance and OL even too, oleic oil, they're both pretty easy to breed for because it's generally one or two genes involved. And so you can make selections. I have a marker for nematode resistance and I can tell you which one is going to breed true for nematode resistance, which one's going to be susceptible, and which one is going to be what we call heterozygous in the middle. And it'll produce progeny that go both directions. That's the best case scenario. When you're talking about leaf spot resistance, I've seen papers that said there's 7 genes involved. I've seen up even more than that, say 12 or 14. Either way, anything more than 3, it's so complicated. The only person that can do those top figures in their head is Mark Burrows, and he can tell you ratios off the top of his head, but I can't. But when you get up to 7, you're talking multigenic trait. And then when you talk about drought and yield, you're talking 400 and 500 genes. So that's what's called quantitative breeding. And you're just trying to gather up as many of those beneficial alleles when you make a cross and move them into the next generation. And so if you think about a bell curve that you had when you were taking tests in school, and most people are going to be right in the middle at 50%. It's the same thing when I make a cross. If I take the parents, I make a cross, it's gonna form that bell curve for those quantitative traits. I want to pick that end of the bell curve that is the direction I want to move. And so, you have to have a population that's big enough to identify whatever that number is at that far end. In our program, we typically make about generally 30 to 40 crosses in the spring and maybe another 15 or 20 in the fall. So 50 crosses a year. And our goal is to develop, we develop several thousand individual plants from that, and to take 300 plant rows into our breeding program that we can then eliminate down to, when we get ready to release something, 1 or 2 varieties. So over a 4 to 5 year period, we go from 300 plant rows down to 1 or 2 that we're going to release. So I've got to keep that pipeline primed with what I'm doing in the population development end of the program.
Well, and I think the thing that makes it hard is, you mentioned that forming that bell-shaped curve, but you've got to test all of those lines to eliminate that middle of the curve back. It's not like you just automatically know this group's out. You got to figure out what group fits into that smaller part of that bell, the positive side of that bell curve.
And when you start trying to combine traits, it becomes that's what I said earlier, the population gets huge, because to get something that's nematode resistant, leaf spot resistant for just one gene, and oleic oil resistance, we're struggling with it right now in our crossing program, because we typically made about we sent about 4,000 seed down to be tested to get 2,000 back we could plant. Well, when we got our 2,000 back, only 700 of them were anything that we wanted, the resistances we wanted, and none of them were all 3. So we got to get our numbers up to be able to send that out. It's beneficial because we get more looks at it, we get more chances to test, but it's just a matter of logistically trying to figure out how to make that work. And you add more genes and it becomes a bigger population.
I think that brings us up to our next question is, how many locations do you have and how many plots in a year?
So typically I'm in charge of harvesting 11 locations. And then we work with, Mark has his program. We also work just jointly with Naveen, Kelly Chamberlain in Oklahoma. We work with Travis Faskey and Zach Treadwell in Arkansas to get our stuff into other environments. So what I wrote it out. I think it's 12, 13. We're in about 20 environments. Emmy Chimera has statewide variety trials. Those are also included. So about 15 or 20 environments that we're testing in. And then this year, we're kind of trying to change things up a little bit and get some larger amounts of seed into the hands of seed companies, as well as maybe some farmers. So, add another 4 or 5 locations that are larger. And hopefully, as you move through that program and get things closer to release, the amounts of seed become bigger. And so you get a more commercial look at what you're releasing. And I think probably over the last 10 or 15 years, that's probably been something lacking in our program that we're trying to kind of enhance.
So I know you mentioned about, just 11 different environments for you. How many plots are total in those 11 environments, would you say?
I'm going to say, if I'm guessing, it's 3,000 to 4,000. And the thing about, so I talked to a cotton breeder one time, and I said, how many plots did he was working for Mark at the time, and he had retired and out of cotton breeding. I said, how many plots did y'all do in cotton breeding? He said, oh, we had 7,000 or 8,000 every year. And there's no way you could do that many in peanuts, because, he was using a stripper to harvest his plots. And, wheat breeders have a combine. Corn breeders have a combine. We don't have that we don't have it yet. We're hoping to get one here in the next couple of years, but there wasn't even one in existence until about 5 years ago, where you could do a small plot harvest combine. And that just speeds up your harvest, so that hopefully you can do more than that 3,000 to 4,000 plots, because we have to do everything manually. And then on top of that, peanuts, you have to dig first. So it's double the work just right out of the bat. And then you're having to harvest everything with a little hand machine. And so that's kind of why that number is not as big as what it is in, cotton or corn.
Well, and I'm not sure if everybody knows, but part of that reason for that is purity is such an important part of a breeding program. And obviously a digging and combine, the way we do peanuts, being able to make sure to ensure that purity makes it extremely difficult, and why obviously you've used the system that you use for years. And again, hopefully we can get our hands on one of these new combines that provide that same purity level with some additional speed, and also probably some lower labor costs too.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, if you've ever seen us in the field harvesting, typically for digging, we have a 3-man crew. We have somebody driving the tractor and somebody standing on either side of a 2-row digger, just making sure there's no peanuts hung up before we move to the next plot. When you get into disease screenings and the plants are kind of deteriorated, everybody's nerves get pretty frayed by the end of the day when you're digging plots like that, because it's pretty stressful. But then when you move to the harvest, the thrasher that we use, it's again a 3-man crew, where you're cleaning out between every plot. We use 10 to 20 foot plots typically in our breeding program, 2-row, 10 to 15 to 20 feet. And you have to stop between each plot, clean the table off, clean the thrashing wheel off, and sack up the plants. If you're good, you can do that in a minute or 2 minutes per plot. If you get into heavy peanuts in South Texas, it can take 3 or 4 minutes. And it's just a time thing. You can't, just like regular farmers, you can't start combining until they're dry, and then you go till dark until you can't see anymore. I've done it with the headlights on the truck a few times.
So kind of to finish up here, where are you at? Current releases, future releases, and kind of thoughts on long-term releases?
So this year's been a pretty active year for us. So I think we've had 5, 6, 7 releases this year between Mark and myself. We released our first 2 high oil peanut lines. We're going to call them Oil Max and Oil Max OL. Those were released last fall. And then we also are in the process. Well, I'm assuming it's been approved. They were supposed to meet in March. A hybrid runner that's moving into seed increase, and also a high yield runner. Those are both coming out of my program. And then Mark is releasing a drought tolerant runner that's the one we're really trying to push out the fastest in our seed increase as we move into the seed increase into things. And then we also have 2 Virginias coming out of Mark's program that are being released. And so all of those are in some sort of seed increase. Oh yeah, and Murray. Murray is a nematode resistant line that it was actually coming out of Michael Baring's program right before he retired. We had the tornado and it kind of slowed down the seed increase on that. So it's going in, it's actually the furthest along in seed increase. We should have 20,000 pounds of farmer stock by the end of this season, if everything goes smoothly, and I anticipate it will. And then of the drought tolerant runner, we're going to plant hopefully stretch it out to 4 to 5 acres this year. So hopefully about that same amount. We're going to actually split it up over several locations just to ensure that, you know, something doesn't happen to it, because we feel like that's one that's so important to get out there.
And then long-term, what do you think we're looking at?
I mean, I don't know how many people on the phone know about our project with Chevron. And then we also have a NEFA project looking at high oil peanuts. But with the situation that Texas is facing with our declining aquifer, seem like we're having longer, hotter, dry spells. We feel like, I feel like that the low input sustainable peanut production is going to be the way to go, and possibly even just focusing on peanuts for oil content on some of our acreage. I think there'll always be some edible peanuts grown in Texas, you know, where you have a good water supply. But for these guys that are looking at declining aquifers, they're looking at alternatives and alternatives to dryland cotton, alternatives to peanut production where you don't have the irrigation capacity anymore. And so what if you can grow a peanut that is, you know, you don't have to put all the water onto it, you don't have all the inputs, maybe even just focus on a few key points of water during the season that can guarantee you some minimum yield. And if that's got a high oil content, then you just sell it for either oil, for cooking oil, or eventually when we get approval for renewable fuels, we can hopefully do that for renewable diesel. And I really think that could be the answer and the savior of peanut production in Texas, in my estimation, long term.
Well, I guess with that, is there any questions from the audience or anyone else that would like to ask Johnny a question before we wrap it up?
I'd just like to add that the board is excited about the peanut oil project, and mainly from the grower side. I think the edible oil is really exciting, just knowing how much we import into the United States, and just knowing that if we can develop this high oil, we might take back some of those imports and start growing them domestically here. So it's fun watching that expand, and thinking about the future and what that can mean to our growers.
I think that's the most immediate answer to this problem. We are a net importer of peanut oil, so why not take that back?
Absolutely.
I'd agree with that 100%.
I have talked with some of the shellers about that, and you know, those markets have to be developed. I think that takes a little bit of time, but I think that's, you know, something that we can do.
Sure. You know, I think that most all companies would rather buy locally than have to import. So I think you're right. The market's going to have to be worked on a little bit. We're going to have to grow it, but there's lots of potential there.
And then if we can get the fuel one, I mean, that's just an unlimited, you know, how much
Right.
we use in the United States. I don't know, but it's a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you both. Todd, thank you for hosting again this month. Johnny, always good to see you. I've told people I would put our research team up against any in the country any day of the week. We appreciate you and Mark and the whole breeding team and all of our researchers. Todd, appreciate you, and thank you all for being here today. And we hope to see you next month when we talk to our county agents around the state.
Looking forward to it. Thank you, Shelley.
Have a blessed Easter.
Okay, thanks.